All right, evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out to the Ward 6 Dems, led by the Young Democrats of Ward 6, our home rule fireside chat this evening. My name is Maggie. I am the chair of the Young Democrats of Ward 6 committee. I'm also the second vice president on the Ward 6 Dems board. In addition to that, I also am on the board of the DC Young Democrats. So we're really excited to have you all here this evening to talk about home rule. And we have with us George Eric Musgrove to talk about it. As we were kind of thinking, like, who can we bring in to talk about, home rule? And I think as it could lead into statehood and talking about that, your name's mentioned quite a few times. So, we of course have, a person who can speak really well about it. So before we get started, I just want to read your bio real quick. If there's any additional expanding on that in terms of an introduction that you'd like to give the group. Sure. The floor is certainly yours. And then we'll just go ahead and get started. We've got some prepared questions as part of this fireside chat of sorts. And then we will at the end have time for audience Q&A. So as you are listening to these prepared questions and you have any of your own or any that you're just dying to ask, we will have time at the end for that. So let's go ahead and get started. So George Jack Musgrove. PhD is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He's the author of several books, including Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, which he co-wrote with Chris Myers-Ash. In 2020, he released Black Power in DC, umbc.edu, a web-based map covering 30 years of Black Power activism in the nation's capital. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, National Public Radio, the New York Times, and The Root. He lives in the district with his wife and two sons and is a proud member of the board of DC Vote. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Can I add two more things?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I used to live in Ward 6, right down the hill. And so I would have been, if I was still around here, in Ward 6 Dems. And I used to be young too, so I would have been in young Democrats.
There you go.
If we were time traveling as well. So thank you.
You're welcome. Well, great. So let's just go ahead and get started. Certainly we've got you here. So the approach for this evening's fireside chat was, okay, as we were thinking about this, last year, of course, we had congressional Republicans doing their thing. Yeah. And also it was the 50th anniversary of the Home Rule Act here in DC. And so, we wanted to, bring folks together, and part of just the kind of goal and, mission of the Young Democrats of Ward 6 is to talk about DC specific issues and how, if we moved here to the district for national or federal focused reasons, there's still a lot of learning I think that we can do about the district and how it operates. So just to start off with the basics, home rule one-on-one. Like if I knew nothing about the DC Home Rule Act, what are things that I need to know about it? And, just starting off with the basics there.
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that we should keep celebrating the 50th anniversary of home rule because it's of course passed by Congress in late '73. You have to have it ratified and then everyone elected in '74. And then the Home Rule Council and Mayor take their seats in January of '75. So we can really keep this thing going all the way for another couple months. So Home Rule does two things very broadly. The first is that it creates a government for the District of Columbia. And so it creates a 13-member council, 8 wards, 4 at large, a chairman. Part of the Home Rule Charter states that 2 of those at-large members have to be from the non-majority party, which is why we always have Democrats switching to become independents and then running for office. I know some of you who are a little bit longer in the tooth can remember when Republicans actually used to win those seats. And that wasn't that long ago. I think the last Republican was Dave Catania, who made a reasonably good showing for mayor after he left the council. But the city had in the 70s and the early 80s a pretty strong history of Black Republicanism, very sort of prominent, organic Black elected officials who were on the council as Republicans. They gave way to sort of white moderate Republicans. And once the party went sort of much more conservative, primarily in the Bush years, it kind of wiped out the DC GOP as a legitimate institution that could actually speak for a large constituency in the city. And now we have sort of those Stalinist margins when it comes to the parties. I think Hillary Clinton got like 95%. We'll probably see something similar in this election. And part of that's just because the GOP dumps on the district so much in recent years. Aside from that, you have the ANCs, terribly important, an innovation that kind of comes up from the grassroots and is captured by liberal members of Congress who look at the Adams Morgan organization as this sort of experiment in local government and say, that's a great idea. Let's sort of filter it into the Home Rule Act. And so every 2,000 residents gets an ANC commissioner. They feed into boards. Those boards then report to the council, and the council gives their statements great weight. And so it's a horrible job because you don't get paid and people give you a lot of mess, but it actually has a good amount of power. And so it's well worth being part of that process. Aside from sort of what the government that the Home Rule Charter builds, it also lays out the powers that government does and does not have. And Congress was pretty stingy with what it was willing to give the city. It primarily withheld the things that are at the core of urban governance. Specifically, the courts, so our judges who deal with felonies are still appointed by the president. The prosecutors, we don't have a local DA, we actually have a U.S. attorney. And sometimes when that U.S. attorney gets really busy prosecuting massive cases like January 6th, they don't pay as much attention to local issues of crime. And so that's definitely a conflict that's built into the system. But then there's really the issue of money. It was laid out very early on in the debates about the Home Rule Bill that the city was not going to have the power to tax commuters. And at the time Home Rule was passed, a majority of white collar workers lived in the suburbs. That would remain so, I think, down to today. So essentially, you can't tax a majority of the highest earners in the city for the entirety of the 50-year period that we're talking about. Terribly important, particularly because half of the land is also federally owned embassies or churches and colleges. And so there's not a huge tax base when it comes to land either. So Home Rule sort of sets up the possibility that DC could go bankrupt pretty early on. And that, of course, comes true in the early 1990s. And of course, Congress blames the city for poor management when in fact it had structured it so that was going to happen if anyone with any money left the city, and large numbers of them did in the late 70s, early 80s. A little long answer.
No,
yeah.
hey, long answers are totally fine.
Okay, good stuff.
Even in kind of getting ready for this, I think I have questions, kind of worrying. I figured you're a college professor.
Yeah. Just cut me off because I can go crazy.
No,
one other thing that's terribly important these days, and that is that the mayor does not has. The council has the powers of kind of a combined city council and state legislature, and the mayor kind of has the powers of a combined mayor and governor. But one of those critical powers that they don't have, aside from the ones that I've already laid out to you, is that the mayor does not have control of the DC National Guard. And that mattered a couple of years ago for reasons that we all know.
Well, thank you for that answer. Obviously talking about kind of the structure for, what was created by Home Rule, but I think, it could be valuable to look at like what actually led to the creation of Home Rule. I'm sure you can probably talk a lot about that and spend plenty of time. I mean, your co-author, I think, a whole book that I think really led up to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, can you speak to that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to do this in two ways, and I'll try to do it quickly. So the first thing is I'll talk about what leads up to Home Rule. But there's actually a really interesting discussion to be had about the debates about the Home Rule bill and why the people who eventually pushed the bill through were willing to accept all of these pretty gross limitations on the Home Rule government's power, like a U.S. attorney instead of a DA, limitations on taxing authority, et cetera. And I didn't even point out that Congress gets to review every single bill passed by the DC Council, and of course it has to approve our budget. It often does that late, which costs us money and interest payments because we have to borrow money every single year to sort of bridge the gap because Congress's process doesn't match up with our own. Okay, so I'll start during the Reconstruction period and cover 150 years really quickly. Trust me, I will. It's going to happen, people. And if I don't, there's not that many of us here, so you can just yell out, "Shut up," and then I'll move on. So at the end of the Civil War, we of course have the Reconstruction experiment in the District of Columbia. That means the passage in 1867 of the Negro Suffrage Act, and so you have biracial universal male suffrage in the District of Columbia. And African Americans are a controlling sort of group within city elections. They actually helped to elect the first post-war mayor in 1868. And immediately, conservative white elites in the city and business interests in particular say, you know what, this biracial voting thing is terrible. Matter of fact, this working class white people voting thing is terrible. We should go back to the democracy of George Washington, the democracy of a very tiny group of people making decisions for everybody else. And so they were thinking, sort of only landed gentlemen voting, right? And so they started to pitch the idea. They basically went up to Congress and, they took them on boat cruises on the Potomac and fed them oysters and champagne and said, let's get rid of democracy altogether in the district. And you can just come to my club or to my house and we'll have cigars and bourbon. We'll sit down and we'll talk and we'll figure out what we want to do with the city. But democracy makes it so messy. Let's just get rid of it. And there were a large number of people in Congress who were very receptive to this idea because they were elitist, because they were racist, because there was beginning to be a move among very rich and generally white sections of the population away from democracy in big cities because it empowered poor people generally. And in the South, that meant Black people in particular. And so by 1871, 1874, they basically start to work out an idea that, yes, they are in fact going to hatch this plan to sort of clip democracy in the district. The problem was that some of the local activists that did it actually engaged in a little bit of graft. And so the folks in Congress turned on them and just said, you know what, we're not even going to have you elite guys voting in the district. We don't want anyone voting in the district. And the bargain that we're going to strike for you is that get rid of democracy, but we promise to give you guys a big fat check every single year called the federal payment. And it will cover all of the different issues in the district. And so you'll be well taken care of. Essentially, they said, you're bargaining away your democracy for money, right? And this worked out really quite well in the late 19th and early 20th century. All those big, beautiful schools, Eastern, Central, McKinley, even that second round of building, those are gorgeous buildings funded by the federal government through the federal payment, channeled through a city government that quite literally doesn't have anyone who has been voted for in it. They're all presidentially appointed folks, and Congress oversees it. And rich people love it because all they have to do is talk to one or two congressmen, and it's a good deal. And then the Great Depression hits. And the federal government starts to get very cheap. It starts to just sort of cut back the federal payment. Federal payment could get up to 40, 50% of the city's budget in the late 19th century. Middle of the Great Depression is down to like 15%. And so as far as many city residents are concerned, the deal was broken, right? We traded democracy for money. We don't have democracy and we're not even getting any money. And we really need it now. It's 25% unemployment out there in the world, right? And so all of a sudden, folks started asking for the suffrage back. Now, two different groups asked for it differently. White DC residents said, we want congressional representation because if we have a local government, Black people will have a disproportionate role in it. Black folks are about 20 to 30% of the population, depending on when in the 20s and 30s you're talking about, right? 25 to 30%. Black people say, congressional representation is great and we don't oppose that, but we really need a city government. So we have all of these local issues we need to deal with. So you start to see two tracks. African Americans are pushing for home rule. White residents are pushing for congressional representation. And white residents actually make some pretty good progress. In the 1950s, with the help of liberals in Congress, they're able to get city voting for delegates to the party conventions. Once that goes over pretty well in the late 50s, they get the 23rd Amendment, which allows for district residing and voting in presidential elections. But this is also right in the middle of the civil rights movement. And so you have another group of people working on a separate track, African Americans, who are like, no, we still want home rule. It's great that we're getting a vote in presidential elections, but we need a city government. They begin demanding, particularly among people like Marion Barry, Walter Fauntroy, a local government, and they're able to get some good dividends in 1968 when Congress votes for a school board. 1971, President Nixon, oddly enough, allows for a non-voting delegate to Congress. And then by 1973, largely because of civil rights activists who were able to defeat conservatives in Congress who had been blocking home rule legislation in places like South Carolina, they're able to push home rule legislation through Congress. Now, here's the kicker. Charles Diggs, who's a black congressman from Detroit, is pushing the home rule bill in the House of Representatives. He's getting hard pushback, not just from conservatives, but from liberals. And they're saying, look, we're willing to do home rule, but we want a hybrid government. We're going to have an elected council, but a presidentially appointed mayor, because we really want the cops under federal control. Because we just don't trust a majority black government to run the city, specifically its law enforcement function. And so hearing that from not just conservatives, but liberals, Charles Diggs essentially says, okay, I'll give you the U.S. attorney thing, right? Walter Fauntroy is saying we need a big federal payment because it's going to cost a lot to run this city. And so we want to have that money. And some of his liberal colleagues are pushing back, saying essentially, we're not going to give you anything. And so he allows the commuter tax to sort of slide through, right? And so all these compromises in 1973 when the bill is actually moved through, because there's still all this opposition and this fear that a majority black city just can't run itself. And so, in fact, we get this very restrictive bill that ends up being home rule.
Yeah. Okay.
I lied. It was too long.
No, it's definitely not too long. No, I'm like, right step. Yeah. So I think, you bring up this, like, I guess, conflict between like this, maybe like differing approaches of this fight for congressional representation and then like local government, local kind of structure, and acknowledging the kind of difference in who was backing those, like, and I think so much of bringing statehood into this, like, is seeking that full congressional representation, full like federal representation. And so, like, jumping forward, I don't know, not jumping forward, but like, how do I guess just now, that we have home rule, like, how does that then inform, going about statehood and achieving statehood in this sense?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll back up and talk about the options, right? So there are actually three routes to congressional representation before city residents from the dawn of the city's history, from 1800, once Congress gets into town. And they are retrocession, which is the only one, by the way, that's ever been successful. The residents of Arlington County in Virginia petitioned Congress in 1846 to be returned to Virginia, to be retroceded. And they succeeded because there were slaveholders in downstate Virginia who really wanted to bring them back. So they had more people who were pro-slavery in the Virginia State House. And members of Congress just didn't really care that much, quite frankly. And so it was retroceded back to Virginia. So that's the only one that's ever worked. Retrocession has never been popular on this side of the Potomac, not ever in the city's history. And it certainly isn't today. So here are the two other options, both of which have been tried in recent time. The first is an amendment to the Constitution, a DC Voting Rights Amendment, that would give the city representation in Congress as though it were a state. And this actually passes Congress in 1978. And so based on this bill, we were supposed to have two senators and two voting members of the House based on apportionment at the time in the House of Representatives. And it goes out to the states for ratification, constitutional amendment, and it's killed by the new right, by Gun Owners of America, by the American Legislative Exchange Council, by Phyllis Schlafly and Pat Buchanan. I mean, it's like a new right sort of big campaign to kill the Voting Rights Amendment. So it dies in 1985. And their basic argument is if you get voting representation in Congress for the District of Columbia, you'll get Black people and maybe a white liberal who will all vote for unions and abortion and feminism and affirmative action. And, my response is great. Their response is that's Armageddon, right? So it's killed before the state legislatures. And they actually had a lot of money behind the effort as well. They outspent DC by goo gobs. The last option is statehood. And it's actually one of the least popular over the course of the city's 200-year history. The first time you really see it in the 20th century is in 1969, when a bunch of new lefties and Black Power activists, who were primarily anti-freeway activists, formed the DC Statehood Committee. And that's like Sam Smith and Julius Hobson, all these people that a lot of folks on the streets in DC were kind of called crazies, good crazies, but crazies nonetheless. They were radicals. And for the next 20 years, their position is still very much a minority position among DC residents until 1980, when a guy by the name of Ed Guinan, for those of you who know homeless organizing in the district, he's one of the founders of the Center for Creative Nonviolence that runs a huge shelter down on 4th Street. Ed Guinan put a referendum on the ballot in 1980, which basically said, if you checked yes on it, that statehood should be the chosen strategy for gaining representation in Congress. If you pass this legislation, we should elect a shadow delegation that would go to Congress and lobby for us. And it passes. It doesn't pass by a lot, but it passes. The council is so freaked out that there are going to be 3 citywide elected officials without portfolio, just sort of running around, that they just refuse to appropriate money for elections. And there's no elections for a shadow delegation for 10 years. But Jesse Jackson in 1990 is essentially looking for an elected position before he runs for president again in 1992. And people like Hilda Mason are lobbying him. So he comes to the district and bullies the council in holding elections, and he becomes our most successful statehood senator, probably the only one that most people can name in the years since. So statehood then becomes our chosen strategy. And in 2016, it becomes our supermajority chosen strategy when 86% of residents vote for it.
Well, thanks. So getting back to home rule.
Yes.
So that's obviously what we're here to talk about. I think, sorry, I'm just kind of looking at what I have here. So we've looked back, kind of looking just at the 50 years of home rule. Like you talked a bit about, the different things that came out and almost like the consequences of the negotiations and getting that bill passed. Has there been any evolution in how we've seen, home rule like used positively or used negatively, I think throughout the past 50 years?
There's been evolution in the structure of home rule. So one of the biggest ones, and it's not talked about a great deal, but in 1984, Congress passed an amendment to the Home Rule Act that effectively said it changed the way that you could pass a disapproval resolution in Congress. So I'm sure everybody after the Congress's rejection of the revised criminal code last year knows what a disapproval resolution is, but basically Congress can overturn laws that the council passes. Initially in the Home Rule Act, a single chamber of Congress could vote to overturn a DC law, and it would go into effect without a presidential signature. So just the House could say, we don't like this law, and overturn it. Just the Senate could do that. The change in 84 was it had to be both houses of Congress plus the president. So that was a huge change, because if we had the old version today with the House of Representatives that we have today, they would have passed 12 disapproval resolutions overturning DC laws. Those were, except for the one time with the RCCA, either blocked in the Senate or had to contend with the threat of a presidential veto. I can't say the Democratic defense of the city was strong, but at least it existed. And so that's a big change. The other is, the 95 Financial Control Board is put in place. And so now we have a chief financial officer. That matters for the fact that Tony Williams first had the job, and also that The chief financial officer today is arguing with the council about what stuff is going to cost. So there's little tweaks like that, but the general system has stayed pretty consistent.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So you obviously, brought up the congressional Republicans, their efforts this past Congress, past couple of years to overturn, DC laws, particularly the revised criminal code. Has this a mechanism that has been used by Congress in the past? And I guess I guess it's not a first. So that, how has, DC, have they been successful in kind of stopping those attempts? Or, I guess just some, sorry, I'll just stop and then let you talk if you have anything to say on that.
Sure. So disapproval resolutions have been passed by Democratic and Republican controlled Congresses across the last 50 years. We have to remember that Congress does have an oversight role in the District of Columbia based on the original Home Rule Act. So, for instance, about 30 years ago, the city wanted to violate the Height Act. In 1990. The reason he did that, and they stated this to the press, was because they were worried that a state of New Columbia, which is the name we were going to call it at the time. Thankfully, we've reverted to Douglas Commonwealth. But a state of New Columbia will tax commuters. And so people who were normally quite supportive said, hell no. And so I think on the city side, there's just not an appetite for chasing away some people who we know are our friends until we bring that up. On the congressional side, nobody has a self-interest to raise that. Literally no one, right? I mean, actually no one, right? People in Utah don't care if they know. People in Maryland who know don't want to potentially take money out of their own coffers, in their state coffers, that they're getting that tax money now, right? So there's literally no one with power in the Congress who has an investment in backing that type of legislation. There's no incentive. Yeah, I get it right.
Perfect.
Thank you, sir.
That's one of the reasons I'm running for Congress.
God bless you if you can figure that one out.
All right. So, final question before we move on to open it up to the folks here in the room. Again, we've already started that. So, I think we've talked about kind of as much as we could, just in the time that we have, home rule, kind of what it is, how it can be, how it's kind of evolved, and even now. So, I think obviously our goal still as DC is statehood. But what can we do, in the here and now, the more immediate term, I think, to protect home rule and ensure that it's not, rolled back or put, further at risk, with whatever happens.
Yes.
Like what can we do to really, protect the district, if it's our self-determination, if it's anything that we currently have under home rule.
Sure.
Yeah.
So first thing I'll say this, and you sent me this question. I thought it was an excellent one, which is, have we ever had this type of assault on home rule, right? And the answer is, even in the midst of our bankruptcy, no. When we went bankrupt in the early 1990s, we had people like Tom DeLay, the sort of hard-charging, conservative from Texas, saying, I want to get rid of home rule. But he was really an outlier within the larger Congress. And even if he had been successful in moving the bill through the House, it would have been blocked by Bill Clinton, right? Even when we were bankrupt, right? I mean, this is when DC residents didn't want to live in DC in many respects, right? And in fact, people were leaving the city in droves in the early 1990s, right? Today, you have a unified, in many ways, Republican Party that wants to get rid of home rule. You have bills in the House trying to get rid of home rule. You have bills in the Senate trying to get rid of home rule. And they have each been given verbal support, at the very least, by leadership. No small thing. You have the campaign apparatus of the Republican candidate for president backing both a reversal of home rule, rhetorical, and laying out specific plans in Project 2025, written by the Heritage Foundation just down the street, saying that we are going to turn all DC public schools into charters. All. We have one of the highest concentrations of charters in the entire country, right? They want to eliminate public schools entirely, right? And you can go on and on, right? Every member of the, like at every level of the Republican Party, you can see this. Never has that happened in the past. Now, what to do about it? I think there's sort of a weird laundry list that I've tried to put together here, and it I'll start with the first, which I think is always important, is that you got to join organizations that are capable of pushing back in some way. I'll certainly make a pitch for DC Vote because I'm on the board, because I think it's a great organization. And we have a very skilled lobbyist on the Hill now that is pushing for the inclusion of DC statehood in H.R. 1, which would be the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, which would not only restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was stripped away by the Supreme Court in 2013. But it would also put DC statehood as part of that conversation on day one in January, if Democrats run the table, right? And so please, Ward 6 Dems, keep sending people to Pennsylvania, right? The other thing I think we have to do, and this is sort of a product of my analysis of what happened with the revised criminal code, is we have got to tell our local elected officials not to break ranks on the issue of home rule. I thought it was a deep strategic mistake for members of the local government to say that they kind of wanted Congress to step in and fix what they thought the council had done wrong, rather than fighting with the council to fix it through an amendment, or just take their lumps, they lost the vote, and walk away, which is called democracy, last time I checked, right? By voicing their opposition and by stating that they would not oppose congressional intervention, they then gave talking points to Republicans in Congress, who are still slightly embarrassed by their embrace of fascism and their attack on democracy, small d democracy, right? And so they would say, so-and-so from the city believes that this is bad and we should overturn it. And so therefore we have a little bit of legitimacy here. I thought that was a horrible strategic mistake. And I say that from, folks in the Wilson building all the way down to that crazy ANC commissioner from over in Hill East, who's still using her account, God help us all, sort of capping for right-wing Republicans on the Hill. And then the last thing I'll say is that, you want to be vocal about opposing opposition to home rule. You want to be vocal with your local elected officials who you can actually influence and touch. I think that you should harass, and by harass, I mean lobby through letters and phone calls, members of Congress who deign to act as though they are our city council. Fine, call them and ask them to start filling some potholes. Tell them what you want, how you want them to vote on legislation. They want you to be their constituents, and start calling them and asking them for things, right? And so I think it's important to not just sort of go silently into the night when it comes to this stuff. If people are sort of playing politics with your life, yell and cry and make some noise about it. There's only so many ways we can influence these folks, quite frankly. The best thing to do is actually to call your friends in their districts and have your friends tell them that DC's self-determination matters to them. That's actually how we got home rule in the first place. DC residents headed down to South Carolina and found a way to get John McMillan, who had been blocking home rule legislation, defeated. They called Coretta Scott King from Atlanta. She don't live in South Carolina either. And they got all the black people in his district and a lot of liberal white people in his district to vote him out of office. And once he was gone, the person who replaced him as chair of the district committee was Charles Diggs, Walter Fauntroy's buddy, right? And then he helps us to get home rule legislation. We want to think that same way today. And I'll just give you a quick example of this. My co-author, Chris Myers-Ash, beautiful writer, right? Absolutely beautiful writer. He wrote this op-ed. He lives in Maine now, and that's why he wrote this op-ed. He wrote this op-ed. He said, "Let My Mom Vote" was the title of the op-ed. And he sent it to his senators and his representative. His mother was still in DC and could not vote. And so as a part of the DC diaspora, he started demanding from the people who consider him a constituent, started demanding a vote for his mom and for me and for all of us, right? And so if we can get people outside the district to pressure their representatives, that's actually way more impactful than us walking up to their office, because they know they can ignore us. They cannot ignore those folks.
Well,
That's 3 things, I think. I can't count that one.
All right. So we'll turn it over to the folks here in the room if there are any other questions, any new questions that have come up. Yeah, we'll start.
Thank you. To kind of piggyback off of the answer that you just gave, y'all get a lot of young people in DC that are interning and just living here for not tons of time. How is the city educating these young people to go back home to wherever they're from? I plan to be here for as long as the city will have me, but a lot of my friends are just interns up here right now. So what are y'all doing as like city people to educate the young population that's here?
So it's an excellent question. It's an obvious question. It's one that we have not had the money to do much about. And I'm talking specifically about folks at DC Vote. We have a pilot program written up, which essentially says we're going to target interns, also all of the local colleges that have summer programs here, which is a lot these days, right? Whether it's Arizona, California, Boston, they all have local campuses, NYU. And they typically ask me to come out and speak just because they want folks to know DC history. So we basically put together a pilot program where we systematically go after those folks and do events where we try to recruit them to DC Vote and then ask them to do that advocacy when they head back home. The problem is simply one of time and money. And so we're hoping to stand it up next year. But right now we're going full bore on the lobbying on Capitol Hill because we need to be ready if Democrats run the table. If they don't, then we can sort of back up and say, okay, how do we sort of spread the message? But yeah, it really does come down to money. There's not a lot of folks with a lot of cash who see it in their self-interest to make a little tiny state, which is effectively a liberal Wyoming, right? Which, by the way, I don't understand, because everybody was up in arms when you had Bush winning the White House through the Electoral College. You had Trump winning the White House through the Electoral College in 2016. And, you know, some Democrats essentially said DC statehood is in our interest. It literally makes sense that we would have a more balanced Senate. If you're going to have a state with 500,000 people that is hardcore conservative, red as red can be, Wyoming, right? Then we should have a liberal version of that to balance out the Senate, right? And you got people like Nancy Pelosi on board with that in 2017. And eventually DC statehood passes the House. But you'd have people like Kristen Sinema, Joe Manchin, which is really ironic considering how Arizona and West Virginia come into the union, but I digress, right? But we have to sort of find a way to convince people who have money or who have sort of pull in national Democratic circles to remember that, right? Like we need to balance that institution. Otherwise, the Senate in a couple years, if population trends go as they are going, roughly, how can I let me make sure I get this right. Like I said, I'm bad with numbers, right? But you're talking about like sort of, a tiny number of senators. I'm gonna leave the numbers alone because I'm gonna mess this up. It's in an article I wrote a couple years ago. But a really tiny number of senators representing a super minority of the American population essentially will have veto power on national legislation on a regular basis. Because think about it, you only need 38 senators. No, what am I doing here? What's to block a filibuster? You need 41 senators to basically grind the institution to a halt. If you start adding up like North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, some of these small states, you're talking about tiny groups of people who in certain cases, if you added up like New York and California, those folks who could grind the Senate to a halt would be smaller than the populations of those states, and they could basically dictate national legislation. And so you really need to be able to balance out the institution.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Maggie, you might want to repeat questions that you wanted to.
Oh. Yeah, can do that.
I had a question. You alluded to when you spoke about how the Home Rule Act came together, the experimenting that went on with constructing the ANC pyramid and all of that. 50 years on, the experiment of Home Rule, how did we do? How did they do when they were writing the bill in the 70s? Are we still testing the hypothesis, or are we kind of done with the scientific method and we need to start again, reframe, reshape?
Sure. And so I will say I use the word experiment very intentionally. I mean, folks literally walked up to Charlie Diggs on the floor of the House and said, we understand this is an experiment. We're going to have to come back and take back over in like 5 years. So initially, and Marion Barry used to say this all the time, initially, there was a real effort on the part of the district government to prove that Black people could run a major government, right? And it's sort of silly, right? Because it already been proven, right? Like there have been major American cities that had Black mayors before this, but DC was a very Black city. Keep in mind, right? When Marion Barry's elected in '78, you're talking about a roughly 75% Black population. You're also talking about a city council and a mayor that are essentially all movement people. Supermajority on the council. Marion Barry is the first former Black Power activist to be elected as chief executive of a major American city. So it really was an experiment that I think the local elected officials passed, right? I just do. That I think they did a great job with a really kind of crappy structure for how to run a city. And there are people in Congress who will say that's not true. The city went bankrupt, but the city was going to go bankrupt based on how the Home Rule bill was written. There's no way it wasn't going to happen, right? And so I think, the city government has done a great job. And since the control board era, we have posted either balanced budgets or budget surpluses every single year for 20 plus years, right? I do think, though, that there are some glaring problems still that weren't fixed by the control board and its reforms. Some of those were fixed. Like when Congress handed over the city, we had all these pension obligations and no pension account. Like Congress was just paying people's pensions out the Treasury. So when the city got here and said, well, we have to pay all these pension obligations, how are we going to pay it? They said, figure it out, right? In 1997, Congress actually paid off some of those pension obligations so that the city could sort of start with a clean slate, right? So some of those things have been fixed. But other stuff like the divided law enforcement function are an absolute mess. You get convicted of a felony in Washington, D.C., you get arrested by local cops, but you get tried by a federal U.S. attorney. You then get sent into the Bureau of Prisons, federal system. You may serve your time in Alabama. You may serve your time in Montana. You'll most likely serve your time in West Virginia or North Carolina. That's typically where DC prisoners go. When you get out, you'll be supervised by a federal agency. I think it's called COSATU or something. Help me out. CISOSA. COSATU is nothing like it, but it did have like the same right? Which has really struggled to sort of actually do its job of making sure that people transition out of the system appropriately. And mind you, that's after they've been in a federal system where some of those federal prisons have good rehabilitation programs, but DC has no input or much oversight over how they work, and so it doesn't really know what it's getting back when it comes to what those that time of incarceration has led to. And so we've really struggled to sort of deal with crime in this city. And then, of course, the public debate that gets larded on top of that is crime is bad in the district. It's all your fault. Never mind that the U.S. attorney, federal official, right? The prisons for our felons, federal prisons, right? The oversight when they come out, federal program. And so it allows, again, for that sort of posturing that we talked about earlier, without really being able to serve some of the most vulnerable members of the district community, either the victims of crime or the perpetrators, who are usually in pretty bad straits before they convict crimes and are typically quite in bad straits when they get out of prison as well.
Thank you.
So I'm very, sorry if you touched on this earlier, but what do you see as the district's greatest vulnerabilities if there was to be a second charge? I personally think the first
Jesus,
time
yeah.
you were able to run the clock out on them in a lot of places, and this time they know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I can add to that. You know, that's a really tough one. So I'll say sort of two things, right? I mean, one, particularly with January 6th, I think ringing in all of our ears, the president's ability to take control of MPD and to control the DC National Guard is terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And, I remember during the pandemic, I used to bike downtown to some of those big protests. And I remember Proud Boys just roaming around, like massive gang. And MPD really struggled with trying to manage that. But part of it was because the tone for that type of lawlessness was being set by the president, who should have been the backstop for a law and order response, and instead was kind of a cheerleader for the Proud Boys, right? And so sort of knowing how to manipulate that this time around, and I think feeling that he had the go-ahead to do some of the things he was reluctant to do last time scares me a great deal. But then I'll sort of say something that may sound unexpected. And part of it is because I watched Trump's barbershop town hall on Fox this morning and was really terrified by how well he seemed to be doing. Not his actual delivery, that was the word salad, but folks were really receptive. This was in the Bronx. And that is that I do worry that he will try to find ways to buy people off. I mean, he's a deeply transactional figure. And I don't exactly know what that'll look like. But I do think that there are some things that he would bring to the city in the second term that may resonate with some local citizens and elected officials. You can see bits and pieces of that with the pushback in the RCCA, right? That if they didn't have sort of this sort of concrete oppressive response, could potentially shift the window of debate into a much more reactionary space. But I just don't know. I mean, I think that if I've learned anything when it comes to Trump is that I have no idea what he's going to do next. And it all scares me, but I don't exactly know what it's going to look like. It's probably the best way I should have answered that. Let's not end on that one. That was horrible.
So going back to the beginning, when the home rule was first really being fought for in the late 60s and early 70s, one of the things that you talked about or touched on briefly was the role that the organizing around anti-freeways played in kind of helping those people come together and organize and realize, hey, we can do other stuff together too. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I'm fascinated by how those two things play together.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the really interesting things about the debate about strategy when it comes to DC self-determination, and I'm using that term very self-consciously because there's all these things on the table: home rule, a vote in Congress, statehood, like they're all different degrees of self-determination. And what a lot of the folks who were in the anti-freeway movement saw was the city was beginning to inch towards home rule. Remember that 1967, Johnson does his reorganization of the city government. So we used to have the 3 commissioners that oversaw the city, and they were answerable to congressional committees. Johnson wanted to pass home rule legislation. He was blocked in Congress. And so he reorganized the 3 commissioners, the presidentially appointed commissioners, and basically created an appointed mayor commissioner and then a council set of commissioners so that it was kind of a government in waiting, looked like a government as opposed to looking like presidential appointees. And the anti-freeway folks said, this is just a new veneer on colonialism. You know, we've got these appointed folks down at the Wilson building, well, at the time, the district building, who, you know, have sort of, who Johnson is quite literally saying, act as though you're elected, to Walter Washington, our first mayor commissioner, right? And at the exact same time, Congress is trying to ram highways through the city. And, you know, you all have been on 395. Like, you know, Chris usually tells this story. Like, you all know that, like, when you're coming up 395 into the city, it just dead ends into New York Avenue. It was supposed to keep going, just plowing through people's houses all the way up into Silver Spring. It was going to render approximately 25,000 people homeless, right? They were condemning houses up in Brooklyn in the late 1960s, right? And the anti-freeway folks who were doing stuff like breaking into the houses and taking the boards off and trying to move people back in said home rule will do nothing about these freeways. And a couple of years later, they said a non-voting delegate will do nothing about these freeways, right? A couple of years later, they said the DC Voting Rights Amendment technically won't even do anything about the freeways, although at that point the freeways have been defeated, right? And so they're saying, look, you can't sort of half-step self-determination. Either you have it, either you're a sovereign in the form of a state, or you're not, right? And so they had a very specific argument about, you know, this process. Someone like, you know, a non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, would say, well, you follow a gradualist approach. You sort of approach it like a lawyer. You know, you get like a DC quarter when they're doing state quarters, and you get statues in Statuary Hall, you know, make it look like you're a state. And then you get a vote for the non-voting delegate on the floor of the House. She had it for, I think, for 2 years, and it was taken away, right? But her argument is that these are precedents, right? And they sort of plow the ground for statehood. Some statehood activists say that's BS. That's BS. It's just like, you know, putting pillows around colonialism, right? It just makes it a little bit more comfy. But either you have the right to push back or you don't. And so they, you know, they've been in a long running fight with her for most of her time in office, right? But you know, that is, I think, the reason that you had this core group of people who moved towards statehood, because the specific example they were looking at, none of the changes that were on the table would actually stop the freeways except for statehood.
I have a quick question. An apology first. I moved here from North Carolina, so 1973 was also the first year Jesse Helms came here. And
God bless you.
he worked in league with Strom Thurmond from South Carolina to cause a lot of just negativity for the District of Columbia.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get a refresher on my memory. You mentioned Jason Chaffetz earlier, the congressman from Utah.
Mm-hmm.
And I seem to remember somewhere between 2005 and 2010, there was discussion and a vote on a deal to give DC actual voting rights, and that Utah was going to pick up one member of Congress.
Yeah.
What happened to it?
Jason Chaffetz killed it, along with the NRA. So along with Harry Reid, Democrat in the Senate. So the basic idea was this. Utah population was booming. You had a guy named Cannon who was in the House out there. And you know, he talked to Tom Davis, one of those old moderate Republicans who was like a real champion for DC statehood. He was from Virginia, and he's gone the way of the dodo bird, right? I mean, he's still alive. He's a good guy, but within the House of Representatives, right? And Cannon, Davis, and Norton basically brokered this deal, right? Let's give Utah a seat ahead of the census, and we'll pair it with DC getting a voting member of the House. And so it was sort of like a bipartisan, everybody gets a little something, make the sugar go down, sugar makes it go down and all that. And it was kind of modeled on Alaska and Hawaii, right? When they were both admitted around the same time, the idea being that one would probably go for the other party, you know. And it fell apart because Chaffetz just said, look, he should have never struck the deal. It's going to give a Democrat a vote in Congress. And let's just wait it out. We're going to get a seat in 2010. That way we get a seat and they don't get a seat. Everybody wins as far as he was concerned, right? And Cannon was defeated in the next election. Jason Chaffetz was elected. The bill died. Along the way, the NRA really killed it because they basically went to conservative members of Congress, Democrats, and said, if you vote for this, we're going to score it as a vote against gun rights. And people like Harry Reid in particular, who's from out west, said, I can't do that. And so they basically affixed a poison pill to the bill because Harry Reid essentially said, well, look, what if we pass it? But there's an amendment on there that essentially says DC cannot restrict guns in any way, shape, or form. And DC residents and our chief negotiator at the time, our non-voting delegate, said that's not going to fly, and so they let it die.
Thank you.
Well, if it sounds like there's no more questions.
Well, I
Oh,
wanted to-
no, sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Well, comment, and first of all, my name is Michael Brown, former at-large city council member, and I was chair of the statehood self-determination committee and worked very closely with DC Vote and DC Appleseed, which is also one of these wonderful groups that helps advocate for DC autonomy. Couple comments. First, I don't know your name. Yes.
Gabriella,
So we did have the resources when I was chair of the statehood committee. And we actually did we pulled into some interns and students. And what we found was they refused it, well, it's too strong for words, but they were reluctant to change their voter registration from their home states to DC because they were like, well, we don't really have, we can vote for a city council person, mayor. They want to vote for 2 senators and governor and Congress. So that's one of the reasons. So we have to do a better job with the questions that you mentioned of educating people for why we would like them to be residency and voting. Accountability, the professor mentioned. If we are going to hold, as Democrats, if we're going to hold Republicans accountable for blocking, we also have to hold Democrats accountable when they don't do what they're supposed to do. And that's one of the reasons I'm running for Congress. I love my auntie Ellen. However, as the professor mentioned, she has a much more kind of kumbaya approach. I have much more aggressive approach. And I think we need to push back much harder because segueing into the other question that somebody had to forget about what would happen at 45-1, you would install a Byron Donalds or Marjorie Taylor Greene to lead DC. Because it's not just about the political part. They also want the procurement dollars there. Our budget's roughly, what's it now, 18 billion or something, 20 billion? They want the contracting. You see all the construction going on. They would love to control the contractor. So that's another reason why it's so dangerous. Last thing, and this is for a question after my comments. When I have debates with Republicans, what they get out of the conversation with me, of course I try to push them. It's all, Michael, it's not constitutional. Of course, I break out my trusty constitution. And I say, please show me where it says DC shall never be a state. Of course, it's not in there. So what can be our counter when we're educating regular people? By the way, when the professor mentioned all the different great names of advocates for DC, and Denise Jenkins is another person. So when we're educating regular people to get more involved in this effort, how do they combat their Republican friends about saying, oh, it's unconstitutional? What is the comeback to that?
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution, I used to be able to do it. The Article 1, Section 7, the club. I might be messing that up, but it basically says that you have to have a federal district, and a federal district can't be larger than 10 miles square. So it doesn't put a minimum size on the district. The DC statehood bill that's before Congress now just proposes shrinking the federal district down to the mall, the White House, the Capitol. So the only person that would be living there is the president, essentially. The president's already registered to vote somewhere else, so no registered voters would be in that federal district. That would still be overseen by Congress, which is mandated in the Constitution. Congress has to have power of exclusive legislation over the federal district, is what it states. Whereas the peopled part of the District of Columbia would become Douglas Commonwealth. And so there's no conflict with the Constitution. Now, I do have to admit to all of you, just in case anybody has read the last part of the bill, that you would have to repeal the 23rd Amendment. And the bill actually puts in a trigger for fast tracking that, right? For the 23rd Amendment, guarantees 3 electoral college votes for the federal district, the District of Columbia. If you shrink the district, that means the president essentially would control 3 electoral college votes if he or she change their registration to the federal district and it's shrunken down, right? So essentially you have to pass statehood legislation and at the same time repeal the 23rd Amendment. But that is not a heavy lift. Nobody has it in their interest to have one person control 3 electoral college votes, essentially have the same voting power as approximately 600, 700,000 Americans. I'm not sure what it is in the House of Representatives right now. But, these are weird and perilous times. And so, maybe someone does have that in their interest. But there is no conflict if all of the things that are laid out in statehood legislation move forward. And I should just add one more thing. I mean, I think Michael Brown is doing us a service in his campaign in that the campaigns for the non-voting delegate have always featured a robust debate about the best strategy for moving forward and gaining self-determination for the District of Columbia. The first campaign was between Julius Hobson and Walter Fauntroy, the sort of father of modern statehood. Walter Fauntroy is one of the key figures who got us home rule and who pushed the DC Voting Rights Act through Congress. And I think that debate should continue until we have full self-determination for the residents of the District of Columbia. And so thank you for continuing that debate and good luck in a couple of days.
Great. I wanted to first thank you, but also turn it over to you if you had any final closing thoughts for the group before we officially close.
I've messed with your questions too much already, Maggie. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you.
But please do contribute to DC Vote. Join Neighbors United for DC Statehood. There are a bunch of different groups out there. Those are just the 2 that I've worked with the most in the past. But we actually have to be a part of the larger process of demanding our self-determination. We can't simply say this is wrong. It's been wrong for 220 plus years. What matters is that there are Americans out there who are not just pointing out that it's wrong, but who are demanding a resolution. And so please make sure you are working with others to get us towards a proper resolution. I think that is statehood.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So before we officially close out, we do have some announcements from the Ward 6 Democrats just to share with you folks. Well, first